management. This webinar is our last webinar in our 4-part series on case management fundamentals. We started our first series covering the case management foundation, and then we moved into our second series where we focused on trauma-informed care and case management. And in our third series, we covered practical guide to working with refugees, focusing on the skills, techniques, and considerations. If you missed any of those 3 webinars in the series, Tanisha will be putting a link to the recordings in the chat for you to stream at your convenience. Those recordings are also on our website at switchboardta.org on our Switchboard library. All right. Now, this training is presented to you by Switchboard, a one-stop resource hub for refugee service providers in the United States in partnership with Center for Adjustment, Resilience, and Recovery. For those of you who are not aware or familiar with what Center for Adjustment, Resilience, and Recovery is, it is a project of the International Rescue Committee and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And that is via the very generous support of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. My name is Tigest Coleman, and I am Switchboard's training officer. I'm joined today by my co-host, Tanisha Harris. She'll be hearing from Tanisha in the chat today's training, and she'll be putting some links and assisting us with some discussion chats. I'd like to mention that today's session will run for 1 hour and 30 minutes and that it's being recorded. You'll receive an email with the recording, the slides, and the recommended resources within 24 hours. This webinar transcript, along with the recording, will also be posted on the Switchboard website within the following days. All right. Let's start with our housekeeping, looking at some of our settings in Zoom. All attendees are currently muted and are joined in listen-only mode. You may switch your audio between your computer and phone at any time under audio setting located in the lower left corner of your screen. Due to the very large size of the webinar today, we've disabled the chat box as it would be moving too quickly and hard to follow. But please keep an eye out on the chat for messages and links from Switchboard to various resources that we'll be mentioning throughout. We'll be using the chat function for some discussion exercise we have for you later on. And to access that, you can click the chat bubble icon and open the chat window and make sure that you're sending all your messages to all panelists and attendees so that fellow participants can read it and respond to your comments. That does not mean that we don't want to hear from you. Please type any questions that you might have in the Q&A box, and we'll address them during the Q&A time later on at the end. You can also click thumbs up next to vote for another participant's question. We have received and reviewed all your questions that you submitted during the pre-registration, and we plan to cover many of them during the training. And then, of course, you have the option of asking some questions at the end too. Finally, you have the option to turn on the automated closed captioning on today's webinar. To do so, you can click the CC or live transcript. You may choose subtitles or the full transcript. You also have the option to change the font size and other parameters. You may turn the closed captioning on and off at any time, but please keep in mind that the closed captioning for today's webinar is automated and it may not be completely accurate. Following the webinar, we'll post a fully edited transcript of this to the Switchboard website, as we do for all our audio and video materials. All right, and now I'm just so thrilled to be welcoming our speaker today, Kristen Guskovict. Kristen is the founder of Humanitarian Empathy and Refugee Trauma of Aid Work and a licensed clinical social worker. She has over 15 years of experience working with refugees, including unaccompanied minors and torture survivors in the United States, around the world. And she's worked with humanitarian agencies and peacekeeping operations in the Northern and Western Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, as well as refugees and immigrant service providers in the United States. Kristen holds an MS in Global Affairs with a concentration in humanitarian assistance from New York University and an MSW, social work that is, from Florida International University. With that, I will hand it over to you, Kristen.
Thank you so much. Pardon me. I'm so happy to be with all of you today, and I'm really happy to be talking with you specifically about these topics. I'm going to go ahead and have us go to the next slide so that we can look at the learning objectives. Perfect. So today we're going to be looking at really three important concepts. One is defining occupational hazards. Then within that, we'll be looking at our own stress levels and creating a care plan. The other is understanding boundaries. And then the third that I'm going to sort of hatch out of that is understanding how boundaries and occupational hazards influence each other. In this sort of work, there's a lot of pressure. And there has to be a lot of good boundaries in order to make sure that everybody gets through it without feeling harmed. That includes you, that includes your clients, that includes the organization. So we'll talk about all of that as we go, and I will go ahead and have us go to the next slide. So to get us started, I'm hoping that you will indulge us in a minute here and take this poll. The question is, refugee case management makes me vulnerable to burnout and emotional distress. Is that true or false? Go ahead and vote when you see the box pop up. And once we get a few of these responses, then we can go ahead and take a look at it. So what did we think? Is it true or false? True. Excellent. So 87% of you said true, 13% of you said false. For those of you that said false, we're going to talk about this throughout today. So hopefully you'll see some of those vulnerabilities. And for those of you that said true, it is, of course, true that when we do work like this, that matters to us on a level that is different from other types of work, then it makes us more vulnerable. And we'll talk about why, and we'll talk about how to protect ourselves as we go forward. So also to get us started, let's look at this question. Go ahead and finish the sentence. Feeling burnt out should be pushed through, since I know my clients need me, means I'm weak. Cannot be expressed, or I will appear to be incapable. Can only be addressed if I make big changes. All of the above, or none of the above. Go ahead and answer that poll for us. And you can answer with more than one answer. Okay. So 17% think that they need to push through because our clients need us. 9% feel as though maybe they'll appear incapable if they mention that they're feeling burnt out. 18% think that the changes that they need to make are huge, and so that'll be a challenge. 10% think all of the above, and 60% think none of the above. This is a very good response. I appreciate everyone's honesty in that, because it feels like all of these things could be true. Maybe none of these should be true. And at the same time, it's hard to decide. And that's actually the difference between our logic brain, where our logic brain says, no, none of these are true. And our emotion brain says, but when I'm feeling bad, I don't feel like I can say anything about it. I don't feel like I can do anything about it. I feel like the barriers are too big. And we're going to talk about the barriers that most commonly appear and how we can perhaps address them as we go forward. So thank you for that. We can go on to the next slide. Perfect. So we're going to start our conversation, obviously, with talking about occupational hazards. These occupational hazards are burnout, but they also include secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, and compassion fatigue. We call them occupational hazards because we wouldn't be vulnerable to them if we didn't have the jobs we have. We wouldn't be at risk of feeling them if we didn't do the type of work that we do. So they really are hand in hand with the type of work that we do. And sometimes people are not made aware of that. I like the terminology of occupational hazard because I like to think about it like a slippery when wet sign on the floor when you're in the office, right? You are made aware that you might fall if you see that sign because somebody's taking care of something. We aren't always made aware when we take a job like this that in fact we might feel bad about it because of the work that we do. So let this be your little slippery when wet sign here, because that is a part of what comes with the job. Why do I say that these are occupational hazards and that we might end up with a different experience than somebody who's working in a different type of field? Well, because of the level of urgency of the client's needs, because of the level of dependence that sometimes clients place on us, because of the level of trauma that we feel like we need to respond to that clients have experienced, because of our own desire to help, which is usually what brings us into this sort of work. And because this is what we consider heart work, it comes from a place of compassion, a place of caring, a place of wanting to respond to the things that have happened to people. And that means that we use our emotions in our work. And if we aren't careful and we aren't cautious, it can mean that we make it hard for us to have our emotions available and proportionate to us in our lives outside of work as well. We can go to the next slide. So what are these occupational hazards and what do they mean? Some of you may be familiar with these, but just in case you're not, let me give you a brief rundown of these. Secondary trauma and vicarious trauma, I'm going to talk about a little bit together because they're similar. Both of them come from an accumulation of doing the work that we do and listening to different stories of people's experiences. For those of you that are working in more specialized case management, you might be getting people's hard stories about what's happened to them in order to qualify them for your services. For others of you, you just know based on what you're seeing from them and what you're hearing from them, what they've gone through. Equally so, your colleagues in the office that do reporting, that do communications, that do grant writing are also exposed to this through the stories that you give them to write those grants and those reports to make sure that people are aware of the hard work that you're doing. But the accumulation of those things results in symptoms that look very similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, or very simply fear. So we end up feeling a little more anxious. We end up a little more worried. We end up feeling a little bit more suspicious. We end up trying to avoid things that remind us of the things that were so bad, which might even include work and our clients. We end up generally having a harder time sleeping. We might start seeing changes in the way that we socialize with people and connect with people. We might be a little less likely to connect with people. And in vicarious trauma specifically, it changes our worldview or our paradigm through which we see the world. So oftentimes we will have sort of a paradigm that says something along the lines of things happen for a reason or something like that. And when we have a thought like that, that is so all-encompassing of life, what it means is that our brain goes and looks for evidence that that is true. And it says, okay, things happen for a reason. Every time we see that connection, we put it in the bucket of we are right, because we like to be right. So we collect all of this evidence that that is true. But in vicarious trauma, we actually change our mind altogether. And we decide that there is no point, nothing happens for any good reason anymore. Well, it's confusing. And it gives our brain the task to go look for evidence of the new paradigm, which is hard and sad, because all of a sudden now we're looking for evidence that nothing matters. Look, there's something else that happened that didn't matter. Look, there's something else that happened. Nobody cares. That sort of thing. And we become overwhelmed with those experiences and those definitions of what life means. Burnout, everyone has heard about a lot more than probably those other two. And so that one is feeling emotionally overwhelmed. It's feeling a disconnect, lack of purpose, or a lack of sense of purpose in the work specifically. And this is particularly hard for people like us who work in a field that we care about so much. Oftentimes in our field, we generally define ourselves at least a little bit by what we do. And by that, I mean that perhaps the first or second time you meet someone, one of the things you say is, I work with refugees. I do this sort of work. This matters so much to me. Well, in burnout, it starts to matter less. And in fact, we start to feel like it doesn't matter really at all, or like what we're doing can't have the output that we want. So it becomes sad, and it becomes difficult for us to start to sense ourselves in that anymore, because it sort of takes apart the reason we wanted to do it in the first place. And then compassion fatigue is a little bit of secondary trauma with a little bit of burnout. So it feels sad, worrisome, and fearful. So if you walk away with this with any ideas of what I'm talking about, I want you to remember that essentially these hazards make us feel really, really worried, really, really sad, and really, really scared. And all of that together makes it really hard for us to connect, not just in work and with our clients, but in our lives outside of work, which are part of what makes us so special in our lives. It's not just the work we do, but who we are. So let's go ahead to the next slide. So in the chat box, if you can, just what are some signs of emotional distress? What do you notice about yourself when you're feeling distressed? Go ahead and type it in. I see a lot of things people saying they feel like they're eating more, like they can't sleep as easily, like they're more irritable, they get headaches, rapid mood swings, hard to focus. That's a really good one. I'm going to mention hard to focus just for a second, because post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression, which are all those feelings that we just described, all have symptoms of difficulty concentrating. So yeah, it's hard to focus. Hard to sleep. Yep. Sometimes we sleep more. Absolutely. Crying, being impatient, that's always hard. I love these somatic symptoms that people are talking about. Hip hurt, stomach hurt, headache, because if we aren't able to connect in with our feelings, our bodies are absolutely going to show them to us. Feeling like you're spiraling. These are great examples. Feeling frozen, like there's nothing you can do. Absolutely. Pulling back from people you care about. It is so strange. We all have a tendency to do this. When we're feeling really bad, our automatic reaction is to disconnect. But actually what we need is that connection. That's usually what will make us feel better. But it is a really funny reaction that we all have. Short fused. I'm just looking at these really quickly. All these body aches, disconnect, headaches. Resentful towards work. Absolutely. Yep. Everything else falls apart. The house gets dirty. Oh yeah. Some of these habits like cigarettes and maybe drinking even come back into play. Finding yourself just focused on the work and worrying about work all the time. Lack of empathy towards everyone else. Absolutely. These are great examples. Lack of confidence. That's a big one, especially when we talk about burnout. That comes along with that. Really, really great examples. Let's go on to the next slide and look at this together. I think you guys have mostly gotten all of these. But just in case, the ones that I didn't necessarily see were hypersensitivity, which is that's where you're the opposite of having that lack of empathy. You have so much of it that you feel more tearful. Somebody tells you something and you're more likely to be upset. And then the rest of this we've all talked about. On the more sort of severe end is when we start feeling hopeless or helpless, when we start feeling like there's nothing that we can do. And what I want you to really notice is when these things start to make it hard to function in normal life. We can all work, quote unquote, through this, going back to that question on the first panel or the first slide. We can push through these things, but the more that we do, the more that it will build up and the lower that our tolerance will get. If you think of our bodies as sort of a container, and you think of how a container fills up, we do the same thing when we push through or push down our emotions. And at some point, the amount of space we have for those emotions to come through is lower. And so it's easier for us to get upset. It's easier for us to get mad. It's easier for us to get tearful because we don't have any more space. So paying attention to yourself will be a good way of focusing on how do I do what I need to do next, and how do I make sure that I'm feeling okay. And we're going to talk a lot about how we start to walk ourselves back from this, but you guys have it. You know when you're feeling bad. That's a good start. So what are some of the vulnerabilities that we have? And again, you're going to use the chat for this, that make us that make it more likely that we will have these occupational hazards. So we as individuals, yes, we all do this work, but what are some additional vulnerabilities that we may have that make us more likely to have this work? Yep, absolutely. Somebody said their own experiences with trauma. That's very true. Already feeling tired or burnt out. That's very true. Understaffed workplace. Absolutely. Generational trauma. Yep. Always tired already. Absolutely. Always feeling like I'm not doing enough. Yep. That's a really good one. Having a similar background, not being able to maintain the boundaries. These are all really great. Stress at home. Yeah. Obviously our work stress influences our home and our home stress influences our work. We don't actually, move one over here and one over there. We're still the same person. Absolutely. Really, really good. Let's go ahead to the next slide and look at these. So some of the other risk factors, young age or inexperience. So if you're new to this work and you're not necessarily used to it yet, it's a little harder. But of course, this is an accumulation of experiences too, like I mentioned when we were talking about secondary trauma and vicarious trauma. So although young age or inexperience has one side of the coin, doing this for a long time and having a lot of experience has the other side. Because the more that we're in this, the more likely we are to have had experience with secondary and vicarious trauma, along with our primary trauma. And then of course, high workloads, any existing diagnosis of anxiety or depression already, like we talked about, tendencies to suppress emotions. And we'll go on to the next slide. So now that we know that we're all vulnerable and we know that we all have different ways that we express distress, I want us to take a minute to create our own distress thermometer. We're going to create this gauge because if you think about a thermometer, and you think about, when you're sick or when your kids are sick and you put the thermometer in their mouth and you look at where it's at, the higher it is, the worse it is. The higher it is, the more likely it is that you need some sort of intervention in order to make things better, right? And so this is going to be the same thing with this type of thermometer. I want you to note that I'm using stress and distress sort of interchangeably, because although, yes, there are some good areas of stress that help us motivate, we don't always notice when stress becomes distress or when it becomes a challenge to function. So I'm going to use these interchangeably for the next couple of minutes to get us through this exercise, and hopefully you'll see where we're going. So I want you to take out some paper and a pen or pencil, crayons, markers, whatever you happen to have near you. And on that sheet of paper, I want you to draw for yourself 10 lines, just like you would be going up the thermometer. The bottom one will be 0 degrees. And the top will be 10 degrees. And I want us to start at the bottom. And I want you to think about a time where you felt fully and completely at peace. No stress, no worries. I want you to notice for yourself what it felt like physically and what emotions it evokes to think about it. So just give yourself a couple of descriptive words for that. What it felt like, what emotions, maybe a reminder of when that was. A moment you felt fully at peace. Or as fully at peace as you feel. Some of us have a hard time with no stress. Now I'm going to flip it. I want you to think about your level 10 stress. Think about a time when you've been your most stressed. What did it feel like? What did you notice physically? What emotions does it invoke? Go ahead and jot some ideas down for your 10 level. Now we're going to go to the mid-level. I want you to think about a 5. Midway between fully at peace and your most stressed. What does that look or feel like? What's a time that you think you were in that mid-level? And as we go on in this exercise, you might adjust it, but this will give you a way of thinking about it. Again, in that 5, what did you feel physically? What emotions does it evoke to think about it? We're going to go back down to somewhere between that 5, some stress, and that 0, fully at peace. What's the mid-range there? Think about a time where you felt somewhere in the middle of mid-stress and fully at peace. Again, think about what it felt physically, what emotions it evokes. Now we're going to go up to the midpoint between the 5 and the 10. What's the midpoint between mid-stress and the most stress? Now, we only get to have an hour and a half together today, so I'm not going to take you to the other midpoints right this second. You have a pretty good thermometer in front of yourselves. So I want you to ask yourself, where are you today? Are you at a 10? In which case you did not do this exercise. You are not paying any attention. Are you at a 0? In which case, why are you on this exercise? Why are you on this webinar? Go to the beach. Or are you somewhere in the mid-range, somewhere between a 1 and a 9? This matters because the higher up we go, the more stressed we are, the more it becomes distress. And the more it becomes distress, the more we need some sort of intervention. We're going to look at what some of those might be. Maybe it's going to be looking at our boundaries. Maybe it's going to be circling back to our organization. Maybe it's going to be a self-care plan for ourselves and implementing that. If you're in the 0 to 5 range, now is the time to be implementing more of a self-care plan. And we're going to get to that in a little bit, but now is the time. The higher up from 5 you go, the harder it is to implement new self-care ideas. And I want you to keep this for yourself because I want you to every once in a while, maybe even every day, ask yourself, where am I today? And what would it take to take me down 1 degree? So if I'm at a 7 today, what do I need to get to a 6? What needs to change for me? Okay. So now that we all know where we are and we're trying to figure out what needs to change for ourselves, what are some common things that we tell ourselves? As soon as we figure out what needs to change, what do we tell ourselves about why we can't do that? What are some common things that make it difficult? And you're going to use the chat function for this to actually implement something that would make us feel better. Go ahead and type it in. Excuses, yep, too busy, not enough time. Isn't it amazing? We have so much time for everyone else, but we do not have any time for this stuff. Other people have it worse. I love that one. I know we always say that. And it feels true, but actually we still only have our own experiences and we still need to worry about those. The sense of if I don't do this, then clients won't get what they need. Yeah, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves. I need to decompress before I get to self-care. Yep, although decompression and self-care might go hand in hand. Feeling guilty, feeling like I need to quit the job in order to get to self-care, absolutely. Procrastinating, kids, everybody else needs me, I can't do it right now. Too tired, no time. Yep, absolutely. I need to stay ahead of my coworkers. I can't ask anyone for help. Nobody else is doing their job. I need to do my job. Nobody said that, but I'm paraphrasing. Wasting time. Oh, this is a great one. Yep. When we are so overwhelmed that we just pick up the phone and do all the other apps and don't even pay attention to it. And then the self-sacrificing. And this is one we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about organizational resilience, but we definitely find ourselves sometimes saying that I have to sacrifice, that, you know, not everyone's cut out for this job. And so if I can't hack it, maybe I'm not cut out for it. And all these sorts of things that are frankly quite mean and untrue. So we'll go on to the next slide. So here are some other examples. Some of these we've already talked about, that lack of time. Yeah, it does always feel like we don't have enough time. And also it's amazing how we can find enough time for everything else and not this. And it's worth giving ourselves a chance to think about why that is. Why is it that everybody else and everything else take priority over what we need? And what can we do? Who can we recruit to help us? Sometimes it's something at home and we need family or friends to help us so that we can take a break. Sometimes it's at work and we need to make sure that we're actually using our coworkers and our supervisors. Sometimes it's actually stuff that we just don't need to be doing right now, like the social media and the time that we take distracting ourselves from all the things that we feel. Denial of issues, it's not a big deal. My stuff is not as bad as everybody else's. I can totally do this. Well, you can, but the sacrifices that you're willing to make here might be much bigger than you realize. We sign on to do work that is hard and good and for less money than we would probably get in the private sector, but we don't actually sign on to wreck our well-being and our family lives and our lives with our friends. Those are sacrifices that are too big. Confidentiality concerns. I can't tell anyone that I need help because they might think that something's wrong with me. Nothing's wrong with you. If you don't sometimes need help in this work, then you're in the denial space. We all need it. Shame, guilt, or embarrassment. Everyone else seems to be handling it better. No, we are all, there's nearly 450 people on this webinar, and I can guarantee you we have all felt this way. Lack of motivation and financial constraints. These are all great excuses that we can give ourselves, but they really are just excuses. If a client told you that they weren't doing the things that you both agreed on that that they would do because of lack of motivation or because they just don't think they need to, you would know that it was a barrier that they were giving you. You would know that it was an excuse, and you would try and work with them to figure out how to get through it. We have to have that same dedication to ourselves. So let's go ahead. So we're going to try and tackle this lack of time thing by looking at boundaries and the relationship between boundaries and burnout. We got a lot of questions on boundaries in the conversations and the registration questions. And so I'm going to try and get through most of them, but please remember to ask your questions in the Q&A just to make sure that if there's something that's really pressing on you, we try and get to it. So go ahead to the next slide. So to be clear, boundaries, of course, define the relationship. They set expectations. They tell somebody what to expect from you, and they help you understand what to expect from them. It creates the relationship between you and the client. They are, of course, incredibly important because if we don't have them, yes, we burn out, but also if we don't have them, somebody doesn't know what to expect from us. And we talked a little bit a minute ago about the fact that one of the challenges sometimes to not only our well-being, but to boundaries overall is the fact that our clients have gone through so much trauma. Boundaries are actually quite healing because they tell us what to expect. They don't leave our clients guessing. They don't make it feel like they have to figure out how to make us care enough to get us to do whatever it is they need. It sets up the expectation. It creates the trust. I had a colleague recently tell me that when she goes to an intake and then she gets the whole list of all of the things that somebody needs, she says, yes, 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 we can do all of that for you. Even though she knows that they can't, but she feels like she has to take on that responsibility because she feels so badly that they're going through that. Okay, it's fair that we feel badly about that. It's not fair to set the expectation that we'll do everything because it's going to be a disappointment later. And that's actually harder. And it's going to break the trust. And it's going to make it harder for the client to relate back to us and to the organization. And that's going to be harder too, because they still need to work with us for however long we have. So it's hard sometimes to think about boundaries as helpful, and it sometimes feels sort of counterintuitive that they would be. But the reality is that when we're talking about boundaries, we have to be talking about them from the very beginning and how we set them up and how we maintain them. Just quickly in the chat, what are some things that you tell your clients to try and set a boundary? You try and say no to things. You try and tell them the hours that you can reach them. Yep, when you're available. Try and make appointments. Yep. Yep, I'm human. Exactly. I'm only available these days. Absolutely. Those are great boundaries to set. Now then, the next question is, can you maintain them? And you don't have to answer that because I know it's hard to. But that's the second part. If I'm going to say I'm only available during business hours and then I answer the phone later, that's not really a boundary. And my clients have no reason to expect that I'm actually only available during business hours if I'm answering the phone later. I like that. Somebody just said something about making sure that people understand the expectations of what we're going to do too. It's going to take time. So people understand that this is all going to be a process. We're going to talk a lot about how these unique challenges of our specific clients influence boundaries. And we're going to talk a lot about how the client's understanding of boundaries are going to be hard for us sometimes. But what I want you to be thinking about throughout all of this is not just the importance of boundaries, but how do I make and maintain them? How do I make sure that if I do accidentally go over them, I examine that for myself and come back? How do I understand how a boundary, and keeping it or not, influences my entire organization, not just myself and my relationship with my client? And we'll talk about that. Go ahead to the next slide. So boundaries are healing. And like I said, I know that seems counterintuitive, but again, remember, our refugee clients have gone through a lot of trauma, and trauma at its core is not being able to trust what's going to happen next, being out of control. A boundary sets an expectation. This is what you can expect from me. And if it's maintained, it creates trust. It gives the power and control back to the client. Remember, when we feel sort of desperate, we will use everything in our power to get our needs met, which includes our emotions and the emotions of the person in front of us. So if our boundaries are loose, our clients are absolutely going to try and figure out how to get us to care about them more. And that to me is heartbreaking, because of course we already care about them. And nobody should have to work to get their needs met like that. Nobody should have to work to make sure that we know how much they matter in order to get their needs met. There are just some things that aren't going to work out. And it's okay as long as somebody knows that that's what's happening. It's not okay if we make a promise and we can't meet it. Boundaries help us establish an atmosphere of mutual respect. It helps us to make sure that we are empowering our clients, right? It's the difference between enabling and empowering, right? Enabling takes the responsibility from somebody and solves the problem for somebody and makes sure that they're taken care of but not in a way that helps them to take care of themselves. Empowerment means that when I'm no longer in this relationship, and of course our relationship is time limited with our clients, they can do it. Our clients have a ton of strengths, but they don't always remember that when they get here, and it doesn't always translate easily because everything's new. And if we do everything for them, they're not going to remember that. And it is on us to help them remember what they're capable of, so that when they have to go to a different service provider somewhere along the lines, they know what to expect, they know how to navigate it, and they're not disappointed. It reinforces the professional relationship that we have with them. And we're going to talk a lot about this idea of transference in a little bit. But our relationship has specific things that we get to do with our clients. And that's it. And it's not fair, and they have a lot of other needs. But it's okay. This is what we can do. This is what our organization can do. This is what together we can do. Because again, boundaries are a part of that relationship building. What you can expect from me, what I expect from you. How are we going to work together? Boundaries, of course, set equity. So we know that our communities of clients often talk with each other. If I go above and beyond for one client, it's quite reasonable that other clients might think that I favor them. And it's quite reasonable that they might think that we don't like them as much. And that takes us right back to that idea that they're going to try and get us to care about them more, which again is exhausting and unfair. So we want to make sure that we're not favoring them. It also throws our other colleagues under the bus, quite frankly. If our colleague is going by boundaries and we keep going above and beyond, the colleague that's maintaining the boundaries looks kind of like a jerk, and we look like the good guy. So who's everyone going to go to but the person that keeps going above and beyond the boundaries, which means you never get a break. Setting the boundary, maintaining the boundary means that you can keep doing the work mutually, respectfully with the client, and then have a life that matters to you outside of work. We never agreed to take on a job that would be our entire lives. Just a job that represents something that matters to us. What about all the other things that matter to us? They deserve our time and attention as well. So setting boundaries means being concise, being clear, not waffling, not saying, yes, 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 I can absolutely do that, but probably I can't do that, right? No double talking, because we hear what we want to hear. So if I say yes, then no, my client hears yes. If I say maybe, my client hears yes. So if I know that it's no, I'm sorry, but that's not something we can do. That's not something we can take care of right now. I wish we could, but it's just not something that we offer. It's not comfortable to say no sometimes, but it is the best way to go, because it changes the conversation from please, 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 please to, okay, let's think of what else I can do. Okay, let's move forward. Thank you. So of course, boundaries are easier said than done, right? Some of the challenges that create a difficulty in maintaining boundaries is that pressure to help that people have talked about in the chat already. Of course, our clients are coming from difficult situations, and so they are going to advocate for themselves, and they are going to pressure you with whatever they have to try and get their needs met. But if you can maintain the boundary, they don't have to do that either. They don't have to play with your emotions. They can just work on what they need right now. There's the pressure of there not being enough help. We need more resources. That's true. We need more organizations to help us. That's true. We need more partnerships. That is true. There's not enough housing. There's not enough opportunities for schools to understand our communities. There's not enough interpreters half of the time. There's not enough. That's true. And even so, we can't do everything. We can still only do what we can do. And then we have to keep moving forward because there's another client and there's another need, because there's another partnership to be created, because there's another report to write, another grant to write, because there's always more. So yeah, there's not enough, and that's true, and it's not fair, but it is true. There's a lot of self-blame and guilt, which we talked about earlier. Nope, not yet. Go back, sorry. Which we talked about earlier. And that comes in a lot of forms. For some of us, that might be survivor's guilt. For others, it might be things that we feel like we should have done, or things that we should have done faster, quote unquote, should have. It's fair, and that's something that you might want to look at for yourself, because it's reasonable that there's something there to give you a chance to look at. I can give you a personal example. I worked in Ukraine from 2019 to 2020, and my immediate response in the last couple of months has been to want to go and do something, has been to wish I was still there, has been to do all these things. And the reality is that I'm a therapist, I'm a social worker. I'm not the person that anyone needs right now in a crisis like that. That's just my own internal pressure. And I can't respond to that. I have to respond to the need of the work. That internal pressure is on me to figure out, just like the internal pressure to help and the internal pressure that comes when there's not enough help. Obviously, there are limitations. There's a ton of limitations. This is an incredibly broken system. But pretending those limitations don't exist doesn't actually help our clients. It hurts our relationship with them. And then finally, there's transference, and we're going to talk more about this later, but transference is essentially when we see our clients as more than clients. We see them as family. We see them as friends. Instead of caseworkers, we see them as, or instead of ourselves as caseworkers, they see us as family, or they see us as friends. And this changes the expectations, and it changes the boundary, because of course, we will do things for our family and friends beyond what we can do at work. We will donate our own money. We will get up in the middle of the night. We will make sure that we're available for whatever it is for our family and friends. And if we see our clients as family and friends, we tend to do the same thing. And that goes back to that favoritism. It goes back to that disempowerment and that enabling. And it creates a lot of challenges for our coworkers and for our organization. So it doesn't respect the client in their own capacity. It doesn't respect their strengths. It doesn't include the rest of the organization in keeping the relationship you have with your colleagues. And it doesn't actually move the clients forward in any meaningful way. It just reacts to the immediate circumstance. But we're going to talk more about transference in a little bit. So we can go on to the next slide. So I think you're seeing some of the intersection between boundaries and occupational hazards. But again, if we're not setting these expectations, if we're over-helping or we're negating our boundaries, we're essentially just reinforcing that pressure that we have in ourselves. We're just reinforcing that need that our clients have of us. But conversely, if we are seeing their strengths and what they are already doing mutually with us or outside of our work with them, then we can reinforce that ability, and we can work towards what's called vicarious resilience, which is the growth that we have based on their growth. I see what you can do, and therefore I can do more. I see what you are capable of, and therefore I feel more capable. It's the same sort of reciprocity that we talked about with vicarious trauma, but it comes from seeing everything else that they're doing and not just the need. Setting expectations, of course, that means that we're making sure that they have expectations of us, we have expectations of them, nobody's feeling disappointed. It also makes sure that we are in a relationship with the client as a team, like we've talked about already, and making sure that the client is responsible for things as well. So when we are figuring out what we're going to work on next together, we are saying, what do you think should be next? Okay, what part of that can you do? What do you need me to do? Okay, I can't do all of it. So what can you take? And making sure that we're both working towards the goal. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the unique crisis that we have right now with the Afghan clients coming in, because there's not enough housing. because everything happened so quickly, because we didn't have any of the time on the front end to put things together like we normally would. And so the level of pressure is much greater here. And at the same time, we still only have the options we have in front of us. So there are going to be things that do not work out ideally. And that was always true, but with the Afghan crisis, it's even more true. There's a lot that we don't have yet, as far as the resources we need, as far as the infrastructure within the organization we need, based on everything that has happened in these last several years. And we still only have the amount of time that we have. So if we take that on as our crisis, if we feel like we need to solve everything, we're of course going to feel burnt out. We're of course going to feel challenged in that way. Equally so with the Afghan crisis, there's a lot of trauma stories coming out. And for most people that have been working in resettlement, we haven't gotten those to that level. And part of that is because of the timing, right? So a lot of the Afghans that came out in August didn't have time somewhere else where there might have been time to sort of process and think. They came right here. And then they were challenged with resettlement and the way that everything happened. And so there hasn't been a lot of space for processing for them. So this feels very different for those that have worked in resettlement before. And if you haven't worked in this before, it's not always exactly like this. So those unique challenges of hearing those stories a little bit more frequently and having people react a little bit more strongly is more constant right this second. And again, another reason that we need to be able to make sure that we maintain the boundaries that we have. If this isn't your area of expertise, if you're not the person that usually deals with mental health issues, making sure that you're referring someone, making sure that you're telling them, thank you so much for talking to me about this. I think I know someone who can help you better. Can I make the referral? Understanding that if we take on the responsibility for creating things that are not there, or the responsibility for taking on things that we're not trained to take on, we're harming ourselves and we're potentially harming them. Not intentionally, but that's the unintended consequence. We can go on to the next slide. So I want to spend a little bit of time on transference and culture, because there is an extra level of challenge with boundaries. If we are ourselves have experienced forced migration in any way, or if we're first generation. So if our families have experienced it, if we have the generational trauma that comes with that. And there's a few ways that this works. One is the community expectations. So even when you go home, you're still the go-to person. If you are from the community that's being served, you still see your friends and your family still see you as the person that will be able to help them with everything. And so you're still the one that's being asked to go to every appointment and translate, et cetera, et cetera. And there may be a real lack of understanding from the community that you have to set limitations and that it needs to stop sometimes. And so it may be a conversation that you need to have somehow, so that you have other space. The reason that it's important to have these conversations up front, even though they feel uncomfortable, is because they do influence relationship later on. I was working with somebody not so long ago who was a big part of her community and also worked in refugee resettlement, and was really trying hard to have some time away. But even when she would go to the mosque, even when she would go to her community center, everyone was always asking her for help. And she was starting to withdraw to the point where she didn't feel like she could go to the community center anymore, even though she also loved participating in those things. And so she was losing some of the things that gave her a sense of community and a sense of self-care while she was trying to create a boundary. And it was influencing her reputation because her community was really getting upset about it. And at the same time, not everybody was getting upset about it. So she was able to finally see that, in fact, there were a lot of people in her corner, a lot of champions for her that were willing to help her find a way to connect without feeling like she always had to be working. She just needed to look at it. She was taking that same sense of pressure from work into her community, and she was only listening to those questions and those stories that were coming at her. And she was missing all the people that weren't coming to her for that. All the people that were just there for the same reason she was, to feel like she had family. The other element of this that can be really hard is the firsthand knowledge. if somebody is telling us something that feels really, really familiar, it is common for us to reflect on our own experience. But that makes our own experience feel a lot heavier, and it disconnects us from our client in that moment. And there are a few ways that we handle this. One, sometimes we assume that the client will handle it the same way we did, which isn't necessarily true or fair. And so it might be a little dismissive of what they're going through. Or two, we assume that we need to do everything for them because we didn't have the level of help we feel like we wanted. And so we break the boundary. So boundaries, when we have our own personal experience within the community, are tricky. And my recommendation is that you work them out with your community. This is where work tells me I need to stop. These are the requirements of the job. This is what I need to make sure that I leave at work. How can you help me do that? What can we do? Because I can't work here and there and maintain all of the requirements that I'm required to maintain. We can go on to the next slide.
Kristen, I'm going to have us take a 2-minute break, and then
Sure.
I know we have some activities coming up, so I'd love for people to just take a break, stretch, hydrate, and yeah, and we'll be back in about 2 minutes.
Thank you so much.
All right, another 10 seconds or so for us to come back. All right, you can take it away.
Yes, can we go ahead to the self
poll?
No, we're going to we're going to skip the poll given the time so that we can
Okay.
go to the
Do you want to do this one?
Yes, thank you very
Great.
much. I understand that there's some really good questions coming in, and so I want to make sure that we have time for them at the end, and I want to make sure that people are recognizing that although we're going to create a self-care plan and there are a lot of things that we can do for ourselves, there are also times when we need to make sure we're connecting to others, whether that be therapists, back to our organizations, or to our community. So one of the things in this self-care plan that I want you to be thinking about is who can help me? Who can keep me accountable? So just for a brief moment, give yourself time to think about 2 or 3 things you wish you did more regularly. It can be anything. And go ahead and write them down for yourself in a column of what. What is it you wish you did more regularly? And ideally, how often in a week would you want to do that? Or in a month, if it feels like you can't do it once a week? And when will you put that into your schedule? When it comes to who can help me, that would be a resource that maybe we need help for childcare, so we can go and do this. Maybe we need help and actually need to talk to someone. So who can that be? Who can help me? Is it a therapist? Is it a pastor? Is it a friend? Who can help me? Or is it I just need to go out with friends once a week, and so the friends are going to be the who? And then who can keep me accountable? Who can I tell that I'm going to set this plan for myself so that they can check in with me once every couple of weeks and say, did you do that thing? Did you go to the garden? Did you plant something? Whatever it is that makes you feel more whole and less like your only work. In the interest of time, I am going to move us quickly forward to, stay here for a moment, thank you, to the organizational resilience side of things. Just as a reminder, when we only recognize the challenges that our clients experience, we only focus on the challenge and the sacrifice and the suffering that we have to go through. But if we recognize, obviously, their strengths and promote their strengths in recovery, then we can also promote our own strengths. We can also look at the sufficiency of our organization and how self-care is something that we can fit in. Our organizations sometimes have blind spots. We often use client difficulties to explain the needs of fundraising. Sometimes we use those same colleagues of ours who are in the community to be our interpreters for everything else, or to be our reporters for everything else, or to be our cultural liaisons for everything else, because we forget that that's not the job. Their job is their job, and we need to find other resources for some things, or we need to find more staff. Sometimes the organizations forget that we need to be able to focus on these successes. We need to look at where we're doing things right. We need to use supervision. We need to use our organization. We can't just look at deficits. Otherwise, we are in a self-sacrificing model. What are we proud of? What did we do right? What did our clients do well? So in the next couple of slides, I want you to be thinking about how you can reconnect back to your colleagues and to your supervisor and to your organization overall, because that's the primary who within the organization can help you take some of this and change it. Next slide, please. So things that enhance resilience factors, I want you to think of 3 different clients in this: yourself, your organization, your client. So strong relationship that is between you and the client when it's the client, is between you and the people outside of work when it's yourself, and it's between you and the organization when it's the organization. Organizations hopefully recognize and appreciate your talents and abilities and say that out loud, make you feel like you matter, just like you're doing with your clients, and hopefully you're doing within your families. Feeling like you have a voice or control over your own life, that's where that mutual respect comes in with our clients, but that's also where our ability to talk to our organizations comes in, and our ability to find ways to control our time comes in, and that sense of belonging. So we are greater than just our jobs. And finally, for some of us, that might be a sense of faith, and that might not look like church. It might look like spirituality. It might just look like connection. But whatever it is for you, that again enhances that resilience, both inside the organization and outside. So think of those ways of reconnecting. Continuing on really quickly to the next slide. There are several ways that we know that organizations can promote resilience, and we actually have full webinars on this. So I'm just going to briefly touch on these things. One is supportive leadership, and that is a leadership that recognizes that these occupational hazards exist. The other is a reasonable workload. If the caseloads are consistently too high, what is our organization doing about that? What can they do about that? Proactive supervision. For those of you that are on the line who are supervisors, are you checking in and consistently maintaining your supervision? I know we're all busy, but it can't be on your staff to come to you when they need a problem. There has to be an ongoing space, because putting it on them just adds another task on their to-do list, and they already don't feel like they have time. Peer support, so using your colleagues to celebrate successes and celebrate things, and also to brainstorm. How did you maintain a boundary with that one client? Because I have something similar right now. And then of course, we're all individuals. So we have individual needs that we may need to address. We'll go on to the next slide. We're going to do a very quick prioritizing exercise. I want you to take out a piece of paper really quickly and just write down a few of the things on your to-do list. Some of you may already have a to-do list next to you, in which case grab that. Your to-do list can go by project, by client, or by day, or by family, if actually what's pressing to you right now is everything outside of work. On your to-do list, I want you to think about first, in looking at those things, am I the right person to respond to these needs? Yes, no, or maybe. If it's a no, move those things to another list. If it's a maybe, put a star next to it. The next question you're going to ask is which crisis comes first, but in order to ask that, you need to figure out a criteria for yourself. So I want you to just write down that question for yourself. Which crisis comes first and how do I decide? What's my criteria? Looking at your yes list, you're going to go one by one and ask yourself, what resources do I need for this? What resources do I have for this? Who can I ask for help? And then you're going to discuss these with your supervisor. Specifically, your maybe list is, am I the right person for this? Your criteria for deciding which one is first. Do you agree with that? Or am I supposed to be doing this some other way? And your resource needs list. Why am I telling you to go back to your supervisor? Well, so that they know, so that they're in agreement, so that if there's something you really can't figure out what's first and what's second, they can be telling you. Because if something isn't clearly first or second, it doesn't actually mean they're both first. There are a lot of ways that people prioritize things. And one of them is to look at what is urgent versus non-urgent. Not everything can be urgent. Not everything is the most important thing. So what can I agree with myself will take longer? And what can I agree with myself needs to happen right now? And again, if this is something that you can't decide, your supervisor can help with that. You're not alone. You don't have to work in a silo. The other way to do this, just so that you know and have another option, is to just cut the list, the to-do list at the top 6 and just work on those for the day. You might not get through all of them. With that first list though, if you're still working on it, remember what you're looking at is, in order to figure out the priority, you have to figure out what creates the priority. And once you've decided what's on it, you have to figure out what resources do I need, which ones do I have, and who can I ask for help so that I'm not doing everything on my own. Okay. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions because I understand there are some good ones. So please, to just go ahead.
Yes. Thank you so much for covering such an important topic. And I know this is something that should probably be a few days in practice, right? I think self-care is something that is not talked about. It's something that needs to be done and practiced. And I know, Kristen, we've talked before about sort of, it's kind of like going to the gym and your coach telling you what exercises to do versus to actually doing it. So we hope that this is some tools that we can give you to have you implement to continue to do this work. This work is really hard. This work is very demanding. This work is very taxing. And we hope that you can take some really good self-care for yourself so that you can continue to do it. With that, it's now time for our Q&A session, and I'll just kick us off with a few questions we've received during our pre-registration. Most of the questions actually have been answered during the webinar, but I've been kind of flagging and seeing some common themes that have been coming up, and so I hope to ask a few questions for you to kind of tackle. And again, we encourage people to continue asking in the Q&A if you have questions that have not been answered. The first one is, how do you let go of some unfixable things in this work?
It is tough, but there are a couple things that you can think about. One, is there any entity that's working on the unfixable things? So is there a housing element? For example, I live in Miami, housing is a real pain right now. So is there somebody that's working on housing, and is there a way that you can support that? Right? Can you get a release to give a story to them? Can you do something that makes you feel like you're doing something, even though you still just have to let it go? And then two, the question becomes a little bit more personal. What is it about this specific thing that bothers me so much? There's a lot of unfixable things. Why am I fixated on this one? That is a little deeper, and it's going to be different for all of us, but it'll give you more information as to what it is you need in that moment to help you feel better about it. So, but unfixable is unfixable, and you can absolutely sit with your client in that and be like, yeah, that is terrible. I'm really sorry that this is so awful. You are right. It's awful. There's still nothing we can do about it, unfortunately.
Yeah. There's a lot of theme around that, Kristen, around boundary setting. Is it related to the concept of under-promising and or over-delivering? Mm-hmm. And then someone else on that same line said, unfortunately, some clients also think that next to God, in their own words, that the caseworkers are everything to them. So how do you manage? How do you balance that?
It's about setting the tone from the beginning, right? So clients will be really, really deferential, and I will try and take a step back from that and just say, I don't know what's the right one. What do you think? What's best? I mean, you know your family better than I do. What do you think is going to be best for them? On this side, you know, we might do it this way, and that might or might not work. On this side, there's this other thing. I don't know. What would you prefer? So I do a lot of giving it back to them to try and make sure that they're the ones in the empowered space. Having said that, it's also just restating the boundary. I wish I could solve all these things. If I could, the world would be a much easier place. And if you have a good relationship that's a little bit jokey with the client, you can say something like that. If only, all right, so what are we going to do instead? So, yeah.
Thank you. That's a good advice. I mean, there's not much that, there's only so much you could do.
Exactly. And to give you a visual, when somebody gives me something like that, I think of it as playing catch, right? So they hand me this thing that's so important. I pass it back because it's so important, it's theirs. And then they pass it back to me and I pass it back, right? So what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? Because I don't want them to be reliant on me. I will have some ideas, but they might not be the right ones for them. So I want them to be brainstorming with me. So yeah, but yeah, it's not easy. It's never easy. I wish we could solve it. Yeah.
Great. All right. And this is something, and I know we've talked about during the developing of this webinar, but just the demanding work of case management, and especially for those that share, refugees and immigrants who also share their own trauma, their own journey of having to relive that and how to manage that. Any advice?
Yeah, I have sort of two pieces of advice. And they're going to sound counterintuitive to what we normally do, right? Normally, when we empathize, we try and see something from somebody's perspective. But if in fact you have a similar experience that is traumatic, don't. Take the step back, just relay the words if that's what you're doing, or just focus on the reason they need what they need, right? So if they're giving you the long story as to why they need medical help, just focus on the piece that is medical help. Give yourself some distance. Meanwhile, the other piece of that is working on your stuff, right? And I say that with all sincerity. We all come into this with a background of life being life. And sometimes the work that we do hits into kind of landmines of what we feel too. And that is on us to figure out how to work through, to figure out how to decrease the feelings around it so that it's not so easily activated. And that might mean therapy, that might mean something with a religious organization, if that's what you do. It might mean more conversations with your family about what they remember about things that maybe puts things into a different perspective. There's all sorts of ways to do that. It also means giving yourself time to recognize that you're not there now, right? So when you do come out of those conversations, if you still feel jarred, Give yourself a chance to really look around and notice what you see, what you hear, what you feel. Go back to those five senses, get out of your head, more grounding activities. There's no easy way to do that. The final thing I'll say is that if there's somebody that really is too close to home, see if you can see if that case can be changed to somebody else. If you cannot do it for right now, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Better to protect yourself so you can do it later on than not.
Really good, really good reminders, Kristen, because, we want the experience, we want the shared experience of refugees and immigrants, but at the same time, it's when we're ready. And also there are some things that really poke and hit you differently. And recognizing that is it's an important part of doing this job. Whether you're a refugee or immigrant, they're in case management overall, right? There are folks who have been, victims of, rape, and having to now work in that area kind of brings some sense out of it. And so really recognizing where you have the closest and where it hits you differently, and recognizing when to tap out and when you need to come in and get assistance, right?
Right. And I'll give you an example. I worked with trafficking victims for a while, and I had a colleague who was a former victim herself, survivor. And she was amazing, of course, at like everything we did, with the exception of working with clients that came from the same country of origin around the same time. And with those clients, she didn't have any empathy. And we didn't put it together right away. It took a few conversations and supervision to figure out what was going on. And all we did in the end to sort of fix it was to take her off of those cases for a while, so that she could take the time to do what she needed to do so she could come back into them. She still had cases. They just weren't those, because she needed to take care of herself and we needed her to be okay. We still relied on her. So, saying that you're going to tap out doesn't mean that you're not essential. It means that you are essential, and we need you to be able to come back. So.
Right. Giving you a break when you need it. All right. Moving on to the next question. Again, there's so much to be said, right? What advice do you have for weekend boundaries? Someone said, I'm constantly afraid that there will be an emergency and that clients are at risk of, POC calling 911. As a result, I feel like I keep myself on call even when I need time off. So really that pressure of having to be available for people because you feel and you think you are
Let me give you the opposite of that. I had a situation where some colleagues did exactly that. They said they were always available, and then they weren't, because they were unable to answer the phone at one point, and it was a medical emergency. And the person that was needing them took extra time to keep calling them. It didn't call 911. Now, the circumstance ended badly, and I think it would have anyways, because the situation was not so great. But the person that I was working with had an immense level of guilt. If I'd only answered a half hour earlier, would things have been different? And that is not a fair question to have to ask yourself. The reality is we're not always available. We cannot always be available. So yes, we have to worry about if they have to call 911, but maybe that's a conversation we have to have in our organization. Do we want some sort of 24/7 hotline that can help them connect to emergency services? If we do, how do we do that? If we don't, how do we prepare them to use those services that are already in existence? Because we're not always available. It's not realistic. Maybe you're on a plane, maybe you're in the bathroom, maybe you're whatever, you're not always available. So, and if that's the time that someone needs you and they expect you to be there, there's a recipe for disaster there. And so I just encourage you to think with your colleagues about how to do that, and with your clients about why you're not always available.
Yeah, it reminds me of the module, the first series on Case Management Foundation. We talk about termination being kind of, as you got to think about termination in the beginning phase, because at some point, our hope is to kind of allow our clients to be independent and be on their own. And so really thinking through, what can I teach my clients to do when, not if, it's when I'm not available, right? And so giving them the tools on how to access it. And if it's an emergency, what is a true emergency and how do you deal with that? So thanks for the reminder. I'm so glad we have so much time for questions. I have one that is How can we break the vicious cycle of this type of work? It looks like it never ends.
Well, it never ends. So no, what we need to be doing is advocating for ourselves in some way to create more reasonable case loads, more reasonable lines of work, right? So we all work with this idea that all of the funding has to go to direct client services, but that includes staff. We cannot do direct client services without staff. So if that means we need more staff, or we need variations of staff, certain staff that deal with certain things, maybe we need a whole cadre of people dealing with housing right now or mental health right now, I don't know, but we need to be thinking outside the box of what we normally do in order to address this. We also need to be making sure that our staff is educated, especially because there are so many crises to manage right now between the pandemic and Ukraine and Afghanistan and everything else. There's just so many things on all of our plates that it's quite challenging. And then we need to be remembering that our staff has lives. So when we're thinking about asking them to stay later, we need to be thinking about flex time. We need to be thinking about how are they going to deal with childcare. We need to be thinking about how are they going to deal with the bus to get home. We need to be thinking about all of that for our staff, just like we do for our clients.
Great. Well, I think I'm going to take one more question. And this one is, it says, when working to set boundaries in a space where going above and beyond is not only common, but praised, how can I respond to clients' demands?
That is such
Isn't that interesting?
And I am so sorry to whoever is resonating with that, because you have kind of gotten thrown under the bus, so to speak. If you are going to set boundaries and nobody else around you is, you are going to look like the one that isn't as caring.
Yes.
That is so unfair. You just set them as consistently as you always would. And you can, if they say, well, but such and such would help me, you can say, I understand that. The way that I work is within the boundaries of blah, 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 or what the organization asks that I do, da, 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 da. If it's a really hard conversation, I always recommend that we take it back to the organization, right? Take it out of the personal immediately. It's not we want, it's the organization says that. The organization requires that. And the reason being that, of course, this work is personal, it will always be personal. But if it feels painful right now, then we need to give ourselves a little space. And the way that we can do that is with our language. So,
yeah. And we have a comment actually that said, we need to celebrate doing enough. And I think that sums it all. We really do. I think showing up to do this work is enough. Yep. We don't do it for the money. So really what you're doing is enough. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. And working from the inside, if you have found that some of what we said about resilience within the organization is really resonating, go back to those webinars, take them to your supervisors, recommend them if you have that relationship with them. If you don't, then think about other things that keep you in the organization and what's important.
Okay, I lied. I have one more really good question that came, and then I'll kind of transition us into the final section. So, how do you navigate the cultural barriers between our clients and ourselves, where we in the West have the opportunity and knowledge to set these boundaries to do the work that we do? So many refugees come to our desk and they don't know this cultural value. So how do you navigate that?
Well, with humility, right? So is it a cultural element? Is it a misunderstanding of some sort? And the one that I really like is actually, you pointed to it before, the termination. There's a cultural element to that is always so funny to me, which is that, of course, some of our clients don't want to stop seeing us. We're a part of their community by the end of this. So they don't want this termination thing that seems painful. It doesn't work within the culture of a communal system, right? What do you mean you're not going to still see me? So they want to bring you more stuff to do so that there's more of a relationship. They don't want to do it by themselves, not because they can't, but because they want you to be in their lives. Now that's a different thing. And that's a different conversation for the organization overall. Do we want to have community events where they can come back, not as clients, but as participants of some sort of event, or do we not? And if not, how do we prepare somebody for that? Yeah. So part of it is the humility of making sure you understand the question, like what is it that is not matching? And then part of it is just saying, you know what, you're right. I don't know why we do things the way we do them here, but this is what we do. And this is kind of what I have to follow, in part because I'm not the only one that's going to be following it. So I just need you to know what it is. Because when you go to the food stamp office by yourself, when you go to the doctor's office by yourself, those norms are still there. Whether or not they make sense or they're right, they're still there. So it's a little bit of both, right? It's a little bit of making sure you understand the question so you're answering the right one. It's a little bit of totally recognizing that absolutely there are some cultural values that our country lacks severely that we would benefit from, but also, okay, this is still the system that they have to work within and that we have to work within for better or worse. So how do we help with that? And valuing what they're bringing to us, because they're right. There are certain things that we do here that are completely ridiculous. And that's the system. So
yeah, I think you've said it best. I mean, teaching them that it's an extension of the system that we work through, right? I can make an exception. However, the next person may not. So really, how do we do that? What's the precedent that we're setting when we're working with our clients, right? What are we teaching them? If we go, we say, well, so-and-so, Tigist said she would do that. Well, Kristen is not Tigist, right? So how do we help them navigate through the system? So really helping them understand this is a cultural difference. This is how things work around here. This is what my agency is requiring me to do. So again, thank you.
You're welcome.
Right,
Adam, sorry, I'm going to add one little thing to that. The other thing that I would do is just turn it back on the person and say, how would you navigate this at home? And how would you tell me to navigate it if I were in your home, right? So that you can have a comparison conversation, because they're systems. We all know that. It's just, how would we do it so that you can maybe hear what they're saying that might have a better way of explaining things than what you're saying, or a more relatable way. So sorry.
No, that's a great reminder of like, how would you do this? Or how have you done that before? So, all right, well, we've come to an end. We have put together recommended resources for you. The full list will be shared with you in the follow-up email that we'll be sending in 24 hours. And Tanisha should be putting a few of them in the chat, so look out for that. These are also the learning objectives that Kristen had mentioned in the beginning from today's training, and we hope that you can now achieve them. We'll also share and email this list, again, the slide decks and the resources and the recording in 24 hours. And before signing off, I really do hope that you'll take a very short moment to complete our feedback survey. This survey takes less than a minute, and it's incredibly helpful to us in improving our training going forward. And depending on how you join this webinar today, the survey itself may already be open in your web browser. If not, please click on the link in the chat that Tanisha should be dropping right now. Kristen, you've received some really, really good compliments that I hope you can read. Again, finally, here's the Switchboard's contact information. I do hope that you'll stay in touch with us and join us for future trainings. Thank you so much again for joining today, and a huge, huge thank you to you, Kristen, and our co-host, Tanisha, who's been handling the chat. We hope you have a great day, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed this. Thank you, Tigist.
Thank you.